Okay, thank you so much. I would like to welcome our faculty panel. I've asked the faculty panel to address two major questions, each of which will have 30 minutes to respond to those questions. And then we will have about 10 minutes or so for questions from all of you. I would first like to introduce them by name and title. You have their bios in a document that I hope that you received when you first came in that gives a little bit more background information on our panelists today. First, I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Diana Bilimoria. She's Professor of Organizational Behavior at the Weatherhead School of Management, and I'm going in order. Dr. Christopher Cullis, Francis Holbert Herrick Professor of Biology and Chairman, Department of Biology. Dr. Kimberly Emmons, Associate Professor and Director of Composition, Department of English. Dr. Peter Haas, Abba Hillel Silver Professor of Jewish Studies, Chair, Department of Religious Studies, and Director, Samuel Rosenthal Center for Judaic Studies. Dr. Alison Hall, Professor, Neuroscience, and Associate Dean, Graduate Education, School of Medicine. And finally, we have Dr. David Schiraldi, Professor and Chair, Macromolecular Science and Engineering. And I would like to thank all of them for being here today. You have in front of you a group of professors who really take a strong interest in students' progress and success here at the university. Our first question that I would like each one of our panelists to address is, how is the dissertation viewed by the faculty in their discipline? So what I'm looking for here is kind of what are the quality expectations, the time commitment that they're expecting from students, what is the relationship that they want to see between the student and their faculty advisors? Ownership of research data, publications, those type of issues they will address. I'll start with Diana to my right.
Thank you so much. It's my pleasure to be here and on this august panel. Happy New Year to everyone else as well. Graduate students in this university are simply the most important piece of the whole research cog, the whole research wheel, so to speak. And please know that you're doing important work, important discovery, and important inquiry that will yield the kind of benefits for yourself, certainly, for your faculty that work with you, but also for the university and for the world. And so I really just kind of preface whatever we say here, that the work you're doing is so important. Take it with that sense of ownership. You're really making a difference in the world. And your research will illuminate pathways and discoveries that will inform future practice. With that said, what is a dissertation, and how do our disciplines look at it? I'll speak for some of the management fields. A dissertation is essentially a first step in an academic career of research and inquiry. And we see it essentially as a culmination of the doctoral program, in which you've had some core classes, generally speaking. You've had some qualifying exams or qualifying process, generally speaking. And you've been able to bring together and inform a body of knowledge about certain inquiries or research that you're doing. The quality has to be that which is publishable by your discipline. I think that's really the kind of standard. It should be publishable at a good, rigorous, high-quality journal, or in some other form that is appropriate for your discipline, whether it's a book or whether it's a multimedia type of presentation or a digital presentation or whatever it is. But to me, that is a quality of the dissertation. Is it of that quality that it can be peer-reviewed and the knowledge base can be enhanced? The time requirements in our discipline, I would suspect that some dissertations, the typical dissertation probably takes about 2 years. Some people do it in less time, maybe a year and a half or so. Some people take a little bit longer, sometimes 3 years or 4 years even. But the general time frame I think we're encouraging, we're trying to gear up towards is a 1.5 to 2 year time frame in our department and in our school. The dissertation is also a time for a very close relationship to build between the faculty advisor and the person the student doing the dissertation. That is the core of the quality of the dissertation, because you're tapping into a network that faculty advisor has. It's not just a network of people, but it's a network of ideas. And by tapping into that, you enhance the quality of your work. So I'll leave it to others to comment beyond that.
Thank you.
Thanks, Diana. So in many ways, I think the dissertation is very individual to most advisors. So lots of people have different ways of looking at that. For me, one of the subtext is what used to be the subtitle of a PhD in England, which was a training in research methods. So that's something that what you get out at the other end is what have you learned? Are you now essentially an independent researcher in the sense that you can think of a problem, you can think through it, you can devise a set of experiments, you can do those experiments and interpret that data, and then move on to the next piece. So you're now going to be, once you finish your dissertation and you have a PhD, even if you go on to do a postdoc, in a sense at that point you should be driving everything, and therefore by the end of your dissertation you should be the world's expert on what you're working on. So when you go into your defense, you should never be worried about who else is on the panel, because nobody should know more about your particular problem than you do. And that's a part of the confidence and what you should get out of that. The part that's always hard, I think, is that as you go through this process, the question is how much of the work do you do during your time as a student actually wind up in your thesis? And many of us look back and say, there was a 3-month period where I worked 16 to 18 hours a day, and essentially that was my thesis. Everything that I did before was being able to develop the skills to be able to do that. So you go through a time, after a year and a half, you've got nothing, and I know my own sense of a year and a half in, I looked at it and said, I have no data at this point. And in England, it was only a 3-year program, so I had a year and a half to get everything done before I wound up on unemployment. And so there's a real incentive at that point to actually start doing. So I knew all the night cleaning crew in the building. They would say hello to me at midnight, and they'd say goodbye at 5 a.m., and I was still, usually I was out for about 3 hours of that trying to get some sleep. But there is a commitment that's very different, that if this is not what you really want to do, then you're going to struggle in that middle part where things are not going really well. You can't see the end. You can't see how you're going to get enough information out. So those are the pieces, and it's really trying to work through that and understanding that's not unique to you. That's the most common experience that I've seen with graduate students. 2.5 or 3 years in, or 3.5 years in, they're saying, I can't do this. I'm not going to get things. So yes, you can. Just keep going. So and so you need also to try to work out with your faculty advisor what's the best way for you to progress. So I know some advisors and some places where the graduate student at the end of the first year gives their thesis talk in one sense. That is, chapter 1 is this, chapter 2 is this. I'm going to fill in these blanks. And that's a kind of production line. And I'm not very keen on that, because I think that doesn't leave a lot of room for people to explore interesting things that they see. On the other hand, and I'm probably maybe too far down this end, graduate students, I'm there, I talk to them, I see what they're doing, I look over their shoulder usually when they've got data just hot off the press and they haven't understood it yet themselves. And I've had one student say, go away, this audio radiograph is still wet, I don't know what it means yet. All right? That's only because I'm really interested in what they're doing. And so it's somewhere in between that. It's for you to find out what works best for you. And you should be an independent researcher by the time you get to the end, so you should be able to tell your advisor, this is what I want to do, this is how I want to do it, and I will come and see you. You don't come and see me often enough, I will come and see you, but you need that freedom, and how do you work best, and how do you develop as a scientist in obviously in biology, so that when you leave your PhD, you really are equipped, and wherever you go, people say, gee, I like the way that person has trained. I like the way that they think. And so you are also going to be an ambassador for everybody else coming out of this place. So if you go somewhere and you don't do really well, then the next time a student wants to go to that same lab, there's some resistance saying, So I'll leave it there.
Well, thank you. I resist the temptation to say what they said. But in the field of English, I suppose the difference for us and for you, those of you who might be pursuing a humanities degree, is you're not working in a professor's lab. So you're not taking advantage of some great idea that we might have that you can then spin off of. So I think one of the biggest challenges I see with dissertation students in English is the training wheels are off. It's all you. It's your idea. It's your new contribution. It's your new insight into the world of whatever literary or rhetorical field, in my case, you're studying. And that's a big responsibility in terms of how you negotiate this relationship. I was chuckling over the 1.5 year mark, which I think happened to me several times during the dissertation process. I won't count the years for you, but I think week by week there were those crisis moments. And really, somebody once said to me, a dissertation is, 10% inspiration and 90% perspiration. I don't know how true that is in all fields, but certainly in the humanities, there's a lot of intellectualizing and a lot of interior world thinking that can lead to all kinds of anxieties and worries about it. So your best friends are your best friends. Your writing groups, your faculty mentors, your mentors of other sorts are really the people that you want to rely on. And I wanted to stress that your relationship with your primary advisor is really important, but it's not your only relationship in working through the dissertation process, and to take advantage of as many of those opportunities as are possible, because it's lonely. Certainly in the humanities, we write alone in our offices, or at least that's the little romantic picture, the professor in the ivory tower thinking great thoughts and putting them on paper. It's really not actually how it works. Nobody has that many thoughts in a vacuum. Maybe a few people do, but most of us get our thoughts by talking to people. So I guess my piece of advice there is not to be isolated in this process, because it is an extremely isolating process. But in terms of what we expect, in English, you're writing a book. My family thought I was writing a novel for a very long time. It's not a novel. That would be a creative dissertation or a creative probably master's thesis, but in English it's a scholarly monograph. It's one of those things your parents look at and say, okay, what are you really saying here? Unless of course they're academics, in which case they're helping you along and you're fine. But it's a different beast. It's not fun creative writing. In fact, it's not fun writing. I'm a writing teacher. That's what I study. I don't like writing sometimes. It's okay. You're not supposed to all the time, I don't think. I do think there are moments of pure bliss when you're writing, but they're few. Like many things, there's a lot of slogging before you get to that really great spot. So, and as my colleagues have said, and I'm sure everyone will repeat, the dissertation is that critical point between being a student and being a colleague. It's the transition between those two modes. Your mentors and your committee are around to help you, but you're expected to do it on your own. You're expected to have the ideas and have the questions. And the best mentoring relationship is when students come to me and say, here's the specific problem I'm working on. This is what I've done so far. What am I missing? And then potentially I can point them in new directions. I can introduce them to people I know in the field who might be working on similar problems. That's sort of the best of the mentoring relationship. So it's not a student walks into my office and I say, here's your dissertation topic, come back when it's written. That doesn't work. I've never seen that work. I suppose it might work for somebody, but it's never worked for me. So the dissertation process it's long. In the humanities, 2 years is probably fast. But too much longer gets too long. And I think everybody hits that point, both the self-doubt point at 1.5 years or whenever it is, and the point of I just have to get done, which is also a valuable motivator. So listen to yourself in that. And really take the time to take advantage of all the resources. You're all here today on a really cold winter day before the semester's even started, so I think that's a good sign that you're getting the resources that you need. And I'll just save the rest of my comments for later.
Okay, let me say a little bit about the field of religious studies, because we're a little bit unusual in that we are a field and not a discipline. That is, we cover the phenomenon of religion altogether, but from a number of different disciplines. You could be an anthropologist of religion, which is what I was trained as, philosophy, sociology, comparative literature, history. So we bring together in our field a lot of different disciplines. What it means to be a graduate student in a field like religious studies is that you're really coming out of a certain discipline, but you're drawing your information, your database, from some religious phenomenon. And it could be a text, it could be a ritual, it could be a geographical space, it could be an attitude poll, it could be all sorts of different things. And the real job of the dissertation, or the real importance of the dissertation, is for you to grapple with those two issues and bring them together in conversation. Do you have control over some discipline, anthropology, history, philosophy, whatever it is, and can you apply that to data which is often very ambiguous and difficult to get at, or requires a tremendous technical skill, let's say in languages and so forth. I like what a couple of the previous people have said. Actually, I was going to start off saying the further down the panel you get, the less new there is to say, which is a little bit like your dissertation itself. So very cleverly set up. But I think the experience of a lot of our grad students is that they're really drawing on two elements. In my case, my dissertation was an anthropological study of an ancient rabbinic text, so I had to draw on anthropological experts on the one hand and Judaic studies experts on the other. And at some point I came, and I think this is true for a lot of grad students in our field, like Wali Kauri when he's running off the cliff and he doesn't realize he's off the ground for a while and suddenly looks down and realizes there's nothing under him. You get to that point, and maybe that's that famous year-and-a-half point, when you move beyond your mentors and you're really kind of on your own and you have to somehow figure out how your method works with your data and come out with saying something that is meaningful and sustainable and defendable in the defense. And at some point, you do become the expert on how that method works with that data. You may not know the method like as expertly as others, you may not know the data as expertly, but you've got that connection, and that's really where you start your career with that understanding. I can say a couple of words. The defense itself is a way of you speaking to people who were your mentors and who were your teachers. It's a way of speaking to them now as a peer, as an equal. A good defense means not only that you're able to explain what you're doing and defend it and to see the problems in it, but also to kind of see where it leads you in the future. But also it's a way of educating your mentors in things that they hadn't thought about. It really should be a two-way dialogue, a relationship between the committee and you, teaching and learning from each other. The dissertation in my field is really the jumping off place. It's what's going to define you for the next 10 years when you go out, until you've developed another kind of research project. It's very unusual nowadays for people to apply for their first job without a publication. You almost never see that anymore. And your publications, whether it's a monograph or a series of articles, will almost certainly come out of your dissertation. So you need also to be thinking about the dissertation in those terms. It's out of your work that you'll be going to meetings and making presentations. You'll develop your first articles. Hopefully you'll develop your first monograph, which I say will then define you for the next 10 years. The last thing I wanted to say about a dissertation is one thing students have, I think, the most difficulty with, and it may be part of the year and a half walking off the cliff phenomenon, is when to stop. There's always more data. There's always more sophistication in the methodology. There's always another author you really should read. And at some point, we used to talk about the University of Chicago's grad program in which students were known, and I've known people who've been there post-course for 7 and 8 years working on a dissertation. And to some extent, I think that you know too much. Now, there has to be a point when you say, this is what I can know, this is what I can handle, and this is where the dissertation has to stop. And there's no clear boundaries. It's really kind of a gut feeling, and when you've got enough to make your point, to be able to get in front of a defense committee and defend where you drew the lines. And that's really also part of the whole learning process as well. And I'll conclude with what you said, that at least in the humanities and religious studies, it is a very individual enterprise after a while. Your mentors, your colleagues, your fellow students will take you only so far, and really then you're on your own. And it can be a very lonely, late at night in the library kind of experience. But at the end, you come out talking to people. It's like a rite of passage, if I can use religious studies terms, and you really come out as a member of the guild and as a member of the profession. And it's important to keep your eyes on that prize.
So I'm in the School of Medicine, and the students in my lab earn a Ph.D. in neurosciences, but I also look at the dozen or so Ph.D. programs that we run in the school. And I'm struck there by how many similarities there are between those doctoral projects. But what's amusing to me is to hear these very, very different fields of inquiry all discussing things that make a lot of sense to me as a scientist. I would not have expected a dissertation to sound like the same thing across these disciplines. And I hope that you're beginning to hear surprising similarities. From my perspective as a faculty member, graduate students are the creative energy of what we do. We're academics. We are all about ideas. Our scholarship and our currency is ideas. And graduate students are where we are building, learning, and as faculty members growing through our careers. The most exciting things I've done with graduate students. So I hope you feel like your enterprises are absolutely key to a university and to the thinking that we do. And I'm talking as a scientist, and we're often jettisoned out into some practical universe. So the dozen or so PhD students that I have had have absolutely taught me new things, have redirected where my grants go, have made me think about entirely different ideas. So it's incredibly important that you engage yourself and bring what you are bringing into that enterprise. Now, in the School of Medicine PhD programs, we expect from the minute you walk into Case Western Reserve to the day you walk out to take on the order of 5 or 6 years. In general, this is because a lot of our work is wet bench research based. You have cells, you have to grind them up, you're going to do something to them, and we anticipate that you won't know the technical details of those issues when you walk in the door. In fact, you might develop a new one. So that takes some practical knowledge, some technical expertise, and you learning from your mentor or others in the laboratory how to do this thing that you might have read about in a textbook. We also ask you to take courses, but from my perspective, that is not what this is about. You then move into your dissertation work, where initially I say, what do you think about XYZ that I'm interested in? I fully expect you to come back and contradict me, to question me, to extend those ideas, or to take off on another one. And all of those things have happened in my laboratory, and probably in the laboratory of our colleagues. Initially, you will not walk in and say, I have this totally different idea, because we're not going to get along very well, and we're not going to get anything done, right? But later on, I am expecting you to say something quite different. In the School of Medicine programs, it is a requirement in many of our PhD programs that you publish first author publications in our professional journals. This is a different thing than a dissertation, and actually the relationship between those professional publications on which you are the first author and you wrote those papers, and the dissertation itself that you turn in for electronic dissemination is turning out to be a very, very interesting set of issues in our programs. Your dissertation, this electronic thing you turn in, is a product of you alone. It should include your information, your data, your ideas. And in fact, I have had numbers of students write things in their dissertation that were very much their own ideas, and I disagreed with them. This is you. This is your creative energy. It is really an exciting time. At the same time, you've been producing professional publications. I'm an author on that publication. So might other members of the lab be. So might our collaborators in Texas be. Well, those professional publications have a very different level of engagement by the other people in that team. Research is done by teams, it's funded by teams or companies or foundations or grants. They have interests in those data. It's very, very important that we shake apart the things that are really you, and I know Denise asked us to talk a bit about this, and what are team-based interests in that dissertation or those papers. And I'm sure we're going to end up talking a little bit about that. I'm actually quite interested in hearing what your questions are about this, but my real advice is your mentors are likely to be extremely interested in your work if you're in the sciences, because those publications have their names on them, so they're very engaged in that part of it. But when you get to the dissertation part, I very much think that's yours, right? So this is where your singularity, you're walking off that cliff, and you're saying, this is my explanation. This is how I defend these ideas, becomes incredibly important. So be bold, courage will follow.
A little bit. So I guess I have to swim the anchor leg here, and we'll be talking about engineering and the physical sciences. There are a lot of similarities, again, between the medical and biological sciences and the humanities and so forth. And there are also a few differences. I guess some of the similarities is, again, what you're hearing from all of us is, this is your work, this is your book, whether it's a monograph or a scientific or economic document, whatever. This is your thing. And one of the things, by the way, just as an aside, is this is a really cool thing. You're going to have this forever. And one of the things you want to, at some point we're going to be talking about quality, I think. And you want to make sure this thing is really well written, because forever and ever, you're going to be able to take this off the shelf and say, I can't believe I wrote this. When was I so smart? I pull mine off about every 2 years, and it's been 28 years or something since I got my Ph.D. And every couple of years, I kind of take it off and dust it and say, "Oh yeah, I did that. That's real. Boy, I was good." And it's so make sure it is really good for that reason. You don't want to say, "Oh God, I couldn't even spell when I was 26." That would be a shame. But the similarities. I went for 1 year trying to synthesize a molecule as a graduate student. I have a table in my dissertation. It's labeled something like the unsuccessful routes to compound 7A or something like that, and it's got the molecule in the middle and all these lines going to it with X's saying didn't work. And there was that one defining moment. One day I looked at it and said, well, I won't say exactly what I said, but it translates. It's something like, oh my goodness, I know how to make it. And instead of making a milligram, I made a half pound of this stuff and slid it across my desk, or my advisor's desk. Later he said, that was the day you graduated. The rest of it was details. And that gets to this point of you are becoming a master. I always think this very much. This is graduate school is a wonderfully medieval construct. It's kind of like becoming a goldsmith, and you're studying at the feet of the masters for a while, but eventually you develop your own style, and you can make your own kind of ring that's different than the boss's ring, and then we let you go and hang your shingle out there outside the store. So the difference is you're being trained to be a researcher, and it doesn't matter which department is represented here, you're going to be a researcher. And I even would go so far as saying, I bet someone from religious studies could probably come over to macromolecular science and in 6 months become a really good polymer researcher, because the rest of it's details, but you've taught yourself and hopefully been helped to be taught how to do research. I spent 20 years in industry, and I would find out this person who was spinning fibers had a Ph.D. in nuclear physics, and I would say, huh? Why? Why? It didn't matter. I know how to do research, and it's just decide to do something different. So, it very is, you're learning a discipline, you're being trained to be a master researcher, and it happens to be in religious studies or anthropology or medicine or biology or chemistry or library science or whatever. Just one or two other points. In addition to this being your book, it's also extremely useful to your colleagues. One of the things, I'm on my third generation of PhD students now, graduated one yesterday, yay. He did a great job. And people are going to stand on the shoulders of your dissertation. And so another reason why it's important that it be done very well, very accurately, details. I would tell my students, the experimental section in your thesis has to be sterling because you're going to be off making big bucks somewhere, and this poor 22-year-old's going to come there and doesn't need to spend a year rediscovering what you discovered. So it needs to really stand on its own. And I guess one other point on this is where we are different than, say, the humanities. It was touched on in the area of medicine. Is in engineering and the physical studies, you probably will publish quite a number of papers before you graduate. I mean, average PhD in my group has 8 scientific papers, maybe 5 or 6 of them first authored by the time they graduate. And one of the things so that creates a different dilemma. How do you write that dissertation? And part of it is, and I think this is also part of becoming that mastery and becoming the doctor, is that you're able to take these papers, which are very tactical. Here's a new way of making this. Here's a new concept about this, and so forth. And then throw your arms around it and say, okay, now I'm gonna say something very strategic that kind of puts all these pieces together like puzzle pieces, and I can tell you a big story of which these little papers are all pieces of it. And when you got a bigger construct that's made of these little papers, then you've really done something pretty cool. And that's you've taught. And I always learn. I mean, most of what I know in my field, I actually have learned in the last 7.5 years from my graduate students. The fields I'm working in right now, I barely knew existed when I came here, and yeah, I knew some of the stuff that's in those papers, but the big concepts from those first 6 doctoral dissertations are all news to me. So it's really obvious when it's time to let people go. Every student I've graduated, there's been that defining moment. I looked and said, okay, you sir, you ma'am, are a doctor, and then okay, now take a few months and write it up. Our writing process, I think, is very different. Our students usually start writing about 2 or 3 months before they graduate. So it's that 15,000 hours in the laboratory that lead up to it. Then the writing is just capturing the chaos. So.
Great, thank you. There's one more question that I asked the panel to discuss before we open up for questions. The second question is, what is the potential significance of the dissertation to the student's future career, whether they decide to stay in academia or perhaps go outside of academia? So I'll start with you, Diana.
Thanks. The dissertation is, in a sense, contributing to knowledge, the knowledge base that is out there. So it is, as a member of that knowledge base, whether you're in academia or whether you're in industry, you can still contribute to that knowledge base across throughout your career. And the insights that you develop in your dissertation are the base on which you stand. It's a foundation of many of your future ideas about the topic that you've been interested in. In addition to that, you do learn the method of doing research. So again, whether you're in academia, industry, wherever, government, whatever, you're still utilizing those principles. Sometimes it's really difficult to translate what you've done essentially to the other people in your normal life. They kind of don't get it. They don't understand what you're doing. Just as an example, my sister-in-law reports to me that whenever my brother has a hard time falling asleep, she tells him, go read your sister's dissertation. And at first I was a little bit taken aback by that, but then I understand that it's a scholarly piece of work. It speaks to a scholarly audience. It doesn't speak to everybody. But it's my job to translate that in such a way that everyone can understand the basic findings that I've done. And this is what I leave with you, Yes, we're doing research that is based in a discipline, it's academic, it's rigorous, it's scholarly, but it must translate to the real world. And if we can do that, I think our dissertations have real meaning. And whether it's a scientific experiment, whether it's a literary thesis, it must be able to resonate beyond a narrow niche of people that are the academic scholars who are in that same field. It must resonate beyond that. And that's my recommendation to you is, in your career, as your career unfolds, it is to take the work that you've done, whether it's in the publications that emerge from the dissertation or other related publications, but to make those into a coherent body that applies to some larger principles, some larger constructs that inform policy and practice in the larger world. That is really what significant research is. It's durable, it has consequence, and it's meaningful. And if your career is based on those kinds of thoughts and ideas, and that foundation, that you take the research you've done in your dissertation, expand on that in a related and coherent stream, so that at the end of a 10-year period following your dissertation, you're able to show how it all ties together, much like some here have discussed. And then show the application of that to some real-world difference. Your dissertation has really been meaningful then.
So I think I have a somewhat different view of that, and I'd pick up on two comments that have been made in the previous one, which is really in the sciences. Much of the work that's in your dissertation should have been published or should be published in a different format. And so you wind up writing two different kinds of things. One is the scientific paper, which has to, by its very nature, has to be a very condensed piece that's making some very small number of points, so you can get that across and get that in press, and obviously that's part of your professional development. There's a separate part, which is the dissertation, which is really, I think, you're writing down and being able to develop this very broad view of where your work fits in the rest of the scientific discipline. So where does it impinge on other people's views? What you're doing here, does that have relevance for lots of other different ways of looking at the world? It may be something very different, but it may still affect the way other people will look at their own data. So it's a big part of that, of being able to construct this monolithic tome that goes somewhere else. One doesn't want it to be too long, but on the other hand, one wants it to be exhaustive so that you really can sit down and say, everything that's important within a certain boundary is referenced in here in a way that makes sense to what I want to say or the conclusions I can draw from what I've been looking at. And so that dissertation is there. The other part, I think, really is that materials and methods section, which is absolutely essential that it is written accurately. And that's one of the hardest things to do. So frequently, you'll write down what you think you did, and somebody comes in later and follows this, and it doesn't work. And it happened to one of my, in fact, to a postdoc. I won't say how long ago, we were trying to make a genomic library to isolate a particular gene. And an institute 50 miles down the road had done this in a different species, and we had their lab protocol, and we followed it, and it wouldn't work. And I said, Noel, go to them and walk through with what they do. It turns out they heated it at 50 degrees for 1 minute in the middle of this, which was important for having the reaction actually work and getting viable recombinants out at the other end. And that was never written down in their protocol. So anybody who did it would follow this religiously and would not get the same result. And so there's a way of actually thinking about it. I think that's part of the discipline in writing your dissertation, to really make sure that if I sat down, is this exactly what I did? Or is this a synopsis? So in the manuscript, you have a synopsis. Theoretically, your paper should have enough information for somebody to repeat the experiments. I think that's very rare that happens. But your dissertation, but if somebody says, here's the manuscript, I can't do this, but this person has a dissertation, I can go and get that electronic copy, and I can see what isn't in this method. And from that, they should be able to absolutely follow what you've done. And if they can't, then in one sense, you're laying yourself open to a problem, because people say, well, this is what you said you did. I've done that again, and I don't get the same result. So what's the difference? What's happening? So I think that's a part. So certainly in biology, I'd say dissertations aren't accessed that frequently. It's what you publish out of that. So you want to make sure that all of those really important pieces are published somewhere. Sometimes there are ideas that will languish for a while. And hopefully, if it's a really good idea, but before its time, as you go through your career, that will resurface, and you'll now publish something which is an idea you might have had as a graduate student that's in your dissertation, but you've never followed up because it wasn't, the technical way of doing it wasn't available, or there was a time constraint or something else, but you can come back to that. So I think you want to make sure that those ideas are there, because you think of them in a context, and they arise, and if you don't write them down, 20 years later, there's no chance you'll ever remember them.
I'm struck by the notion of the ability to repeat experiments, and certainly in English, there's not a lab to go to and repeat things, but certainly in the humanities and in English in particular, your logic is what's repeatable, and it's got to be clear. Your reasoning that leads you to the conclusions that you make is equally fundamental. So if you skip this step, the 50 minutes of heating, equivalent to, oh yeah, and then I read some Althusser and it really changed my life, there's some interesting similarities there, though perhaps the mechanics of it are a little bit different. Just briefly, we've said before on this panel, your dissertation defines you for approximately 10 years. Take that seriously, but don't let it scare you. My cautionary tale is I got this brilliant idea in graduate school that I would work on rhetorics of depression. I've spent the last 15 years of my life reading books about people who are depressed, okay? And it's been fascinating. It's been a great learning experience for me. But if I knew then what I know now, I might not have chosen that topic. In the sense that writing a dissertation is very depressing in some moments, and there's I suppose in the medical world it's the psychosomatic kind of talking yourself into things. But I've had this discussion with some of my graduate students. When you choose a topic, you're choosing an identity for that first part of your career. So a young woman wanted to write on complications with childbirth. And we had a long conversation. She was of childbearing age, and we thought about, is this something she wants to spend a long time reading narratives about at this point in her life? And ultimately, she made the decision that for her, that project was going to wait. It's something she's interested in, but it's going to wait until she sort of has some time to develop other methodologies. That doesn't mean you shouldn't do the thing that you really want to do, but it does mean to be careful about what you select. If you're doing it simply because it looks like an easy path, I think my colleagues would agree, it won't be easy. So pick something that you're really interested in, and then sort of follow it through. I'm not sorry that I chose what I chose in graduate school, but I would go back and tell my former self to think a little more carefully about it at the time, so I wouldn't have been quite so surprised by turning up on the job market as the depression lady. The second thing I wanted to say that we've already started to mention is the issue of publication. And in the humanities, you're not going to write 8 articles in graduate school, and you're not going to collaboratively write many articles in your career yet. I think that's starting to change. I hope it changes, because frankly, writing is lonely, and writing with someone is usually much, much more rewarding. But at the moment, single author publications are the gold standard. Single authored peer-reviewed publications, I should say. And as Peter said, it's very uncommon now for graduate students in the humanities to get jobs without having at least a publication on their CV. So while we don't have quite the same relationship between the scientific articles and the dissertation, that disconnect that some of my colleagues have talked about, you will still have to chunk out a piece of your dissertation to publish in a scholarly venue. So the dissertation topic itself it needs to be significant enough to be able to publish something. You have to have something new to say. And the last thing I would say about the significance are two things. First, the dissertation is your opportunity to define your scholarly community. Who are the people that you're arguing with? What are the ideas that are most relevant? I think, Chris, you said sort of defining that area very closely, identifying those questions of what it is that is most important to you, I think is really important. And the second piece of it is the methodology, not necessarily of the research, which is kind of how you're defining a scholarly field, but how you're going to be a scholar. And that's referring back to my comments about writing groups. In the College of Arts and Sciences, we have had a longstanding dissertation seminar for humanities and social science students that meets all semester, where students work with each other and sort of have themselves to be accountable to for work on their dissertations. Anything you can take advantage of like that, any kinds of professional contacts you can make during the process of writing the dissertation, and your mentors can help with this. This is your chance to make that network. When you leave the nest, in some ways, when you get that great moment of you're a doctor, now just go write it up, which isn't quite how it happens in English, but when you're there, you don't want to be there totally alone. So reaching out and making those connections to other scholars in your field. If you find someone, I was told in graduate school, and it's very true, you will find a dissertation that looks exactly like what you're doing at some point in your process, and you'll panic, and you'll say, oh no, I have to throw it all away, I have to start over, and I only have X years of funding. Rather than running away, I would suggest contacting that person, because it will turn out that their project is not exactly like yours, but what they have is a really great bibliography that'll help you see where your ideas fit. So I guess those are my pieces of advice in terms of establishing yourself and how to make that jumping off a cliff feel a little less scary.
Just a couple of quick thoughts. First of all, what will happen when you're writing a dissertation is you're going to find yourself extremely focused for a long period of time on a very narrow problem. There are two issues about that. One is that my dissertation advisor, I still remember this because he hammered it into our heads. Sometimes it felt quite real. You always have to ask yourself, so what? Right? And what you said, Professor Cullis said, put yourself in the larger conversation. For any article you write, any monograph, whatever, so what? Who am I talking to and what contribution am I making? And I think it's important to keep that, so what? Why is this important in your head, despite all of that? The other thing you will discover is after you've worked very, very hard to become an expert in a very, very tiny area, you're going to go out either into industry, academia, and ask to be doing very general kinds of stuff. One of the hires we made in my department was somebody who was working on a very obscure sect in Hinduism, and in a very specific text within that sect, and was an expert in that sect and in that text and all of that. And the first thing we asked him to do was, you need to teach Eastern religions, all right? The good thing about a dissertation, and it's one of the surprising things, is that no matter how narrowly focused you are, and I think you said this very well, the skills become transferable. Once you've really wrestled with a method and on a very small topic, you'll find that you can replicate that to some extent again and again and again. And that the skills, the intellectual training that a dissertation involved really gives you the tools to do a lot of other things that you really didn't think you were going to be able to do. And it's important to keep in mind those kind of two things. Why is this narrow thing you're doing important, but also it's really training you to do a lot of other neighboring kinds of things, which is probably what you're going to be asked to do if you stay in academia or if you move out into the non-academic world.
So in the sciences, we all write these dissertations and we all write these publications. I think I had 5 publications from my doctoral work. 3 of those were adapted or represented in various ways as chapters in my dissertation. Very typically, we would put a 25-page general introduction to the important questions of the field and a 25-page general discussion of so what, now that you've done all this important work, how is the world different? And that's a pretty typical biomedical PhD dissertation. The emphasis is really on those publications or the research that's coming through that are leading to the content part of that dissertation. And what's different about a dissertation than those publications is some of the chapters include negative data, all the things that didn't work. I can't publish that. My colleagues don't want to see all the things that didn't work. So it's a place for us to talk about why it didn't work, what was the thinking, where were the advances, so on and so forth, or other aspects that the general world and all its fads in our professions aren't interested in right this minute. So it is very, very personal. I have to say, I neither remember when I earned my PhD, nor have I opened my dissertation since that time. I have, however, slept very closely with it like a teddy bear, because it does tell you that you have solved one set of scholarly problems. It's incredibly important in building your confidence that this is something you can do, right? Some of you don't believe that yet. This will be a transformation. As you mentioned, you will be asked to take this skill of looking at something very tiny and coming up with your so whats and your new innovations and apply it to something else, right? And those skills are, thankfully, transferable. In the sciences, you are generally expected to change microfields after your PhD and do something else in your postdoctoral position. This is alarming. So here you are for the first time in your life, knowing something. You are the world's expert in something or other. You've defended it to your colleagues. They are so proud of you. You are a real colleague. This is fantastic. You walk into your postdoc and you know nothing. You don't know how to do the experiment. You don't know who did what in that experiment. You know nothing. And you are expected very, very quickly to be putting out a publication a year as a postdoc in these scholarly journals where everybody else knows what they're doing. Fortunately, your PhD training does transfer into your ability to find the key questions, the key background, the key components that will let you do this faster as you go forward in your career. So my PhD is not very important to what I do as a faculty member in terms of content. It was very important, and my students' dissertations are very important to the subsequent thinking in that laboratory. So we do go back and look at the methods. We do go back and look at what failed, and that is contributing to that environment really well. There's a second thing that dissertations do that publications don't, from the faculty perspective. And I know you're saying you're doing this, but it actually forces the PhD students to see what other people said about this subject previously. It's very, very difficult to encourage graduate students to look back at the first time somebody talked about what they learned about cells or DNA or concepts or discoveries that led to Nobel Prizes. I absolutely see an emphasis, partly because we're driven by publications, to look at something that was written in the last 5 or 10 years and think that's historical. So the dissertation and your committee will force you to go back 100, 200 years and look at how thinking has evolved, because remember, our currency is ideas, and you learn a lot from the rationale of previous ideas. So I think that the dissertation per se poses very interesting proximal questions, but it also gives you, as we're all saying today, very transferable skills at approaching the next different question that you'll face either in industry or in continued academics. It is training you in some very transferable skills.
I think the things that have been said transfer very nicely to engineering and the physical sciences. Maybe the major difference, I think, is maybe the time constant, in that in humanities, your dissertation may define you for 10 years or something like that. In engineering, it probably defines you for 1 to 3 years. A story I always tell the freshmen in the freshman class I teach is I have never taken a polymer class in my life. I have never taken an engineering class in my life, which is why I'm a professor of polymer engineering. So 20 some odd years later, there's not a lot of connectivity between what I did as a graduate student and what I do professionally now. It got me my first job, which was related very closely. If you go into industry, industry's going to want to hire someone who looks like the job, because they want you not to have a 3-month lag time. They want you to have about a 3-hour lag time between you step on the bench and you're making them money. I mean, that's what industry's about. If you postdoc, you're instead of taking a couple years to get your feet, you get the 3 months to get your feet, and then you better be cranking out those publications, as was said before. Government labs probably somewhere in between. The other thing that in our area is maybe hasn't been emphasized a lot is the importance of the uber importance of being differentiated from what you did as a graduate student. We were interviewing a faculty candidate yesterday. If that faculty candidate proposed things that look like what his thesis advisor does for a living, we would have written that person off as a lightweight and would have no interest in him. So he's had to go through this mental gyration in a period of 2 years of reinventing himself, standing on the shoulders of his own doctoral work, but defining something that's rather different and exciting and so forth. And that's a tough challenge. So it's a time constant. We're forced to reinvent ourselves very quickly, and I think you find in our area over the course of our career we'll reinvent ourselves multiple times. I'm probably on my 4th or 5th incarnation at this point professionally, and with a couple more to go, I hope.
Thank you. I would like to open the floor for questions. When you do have a question, just raise your hand, but also if you can identify the department that you're from, that would be wonderful. Questions? Don't be shy. Yes, please.
My name is Amir Omar. I'm from Francis Bay Baltimore School of Nursing, Ph.D. student. I want to ask about that you said that my dissertation is my own work. So for what extent that I can write my point of view or my ideas inside this dissertation without putting references? Like, if I have many definitions for one thing, and I can come up with my definition, so can I do this with my dissertation?
So, your work is based on work that has been done by many, many other scholars in the past. Part of your dissertation should be recognizing those previous contributions that have led to the way that you think today. Those ideas, and in fact, we can, in our own disciplines, think, so-and-so was the first person to have this concept or idea. We can really identify a person with a new idea. Those ideas need to be referenced back to that person. That was their contribution into the academics and our understanding of your field. So I would imagine in your introduction, you will have many references to previous ideas that have contributed to the way you think today. That's pretty typical. So you say, so-and-so first thought that X, Y, Z, and somebody else discovered this other thing, and now I'm beginning to build on that in this different direction. Yeah? The content of your dissertation is likely to include a lot of ideas that might be yours. Remember that your dissertation is something you will also defend to your committee, among others, and your mentor, from whom many of these ideas might have been discussed very actively for a couple of years. Your discussion in a dissertation is likely to be almost entirely your ideas, often defending against previous work. I disagree with XYZ because of these important reasons. Or, although so-and-so said this critical thing, it's moved on in this area to this other area. You will be defending yourself against previous ideas that you believe are right or wrong. Unlike scientific publications where we might all be authors on one paper and we're going to grapple with saying it the right way to our very focused colleagues, my feeling about a dissertation from a student, it is their publication. You could disagree with me as the mentor. You could disagree with people on the committee. It has to be right. It has to be copyright permissible. There are some interesting issues there, particularly if the work has been done by teams. But when I read my students' dissertation, in particular the discussion, I say, this is yours. I might disagree with this, or you might want to talk about that, or I don't understand this. It's yours.
Let me just add a thought to that. I think it's okay to redefine terms or to put your own thoughts in. As a matter of fact, part of that is what you have to do. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, you still want to be part of the overall conversation. And I think if you redefine things too much, people will say, oh, that's really interesting, but I don't know what to do with that because it only works within its own universe of discourse. Mm-hmm. So you have to find a balance of saying things that are new and different, redefining and massaging on the one hand, and becoming so idiosyncratic that it really is not helpful to anybody else, because it's so individualized.
I think I just want to have a slight note of caution in something that I heard in your question, which may not have been meant like that. I think many of us who have something that we have a spark, we say, gee, that's a new idea, this is where it came from. You talk to your colleagues who you've been talking to, and more often than not, somebody will say, well, this conversation was had either in this meeting or we had this conversation or something else. So yes, we do synthesize things. And we frequently synthesize things in a way that we think that's wholly coming from internally, because we don't necessarily remember those individual conversations that led up to that. And I think if you're doing something that's novel and innovative, you will be making those connections. But those connections are almost always built on something else. They don't sort of appear in a flash of inspiration with no context. And so everything that you do certainly in science dissertation, where you're talking to people, you go to a meeting, you hear something in a different field that does spark that your subconscious winds up working on, and you come up and say, wow, this is a really neat way of doing this. I'm not saying people don't have original thoughts, because obviously I believe we all do, but those original thoughts are not necessarily from the ground up. They're built on all sorts of other things. There's lots of little pieces. That compilation is frequently what defines people. You say, well, that person is really smart because they come up with this new way of saying something which pulls what had apparently been disparate threads together. But those threads are still there. So yes, you do come up with a brand new idea. But I think in this whole process of talking with people, I would say I have seen more arguments about the genesis of an idea where somebody says, oh, I thought of this, and somebody else will say, we talked about this, and there's no way of resolving that. But I think you have to be very careful about how you internalize whether that's yours, and whether you feel the results of saying, no, I really want to put this down, that this is absolutely my idea, and potentially alienate part of the support group that you will need subsequently, and say, I don't necessarily agree with them, but I'm not going to be as dogmatic about that because, sometime down the line, the same thing may well happen to me, and I think I just have to be a little bit careful with that. So I don't know if that was meant in your question, but I think that is what I see is frequently who owns what and what's mine and what's somebody else's. If you're doing it in isolation, if you're writing in a darkened room with nobody else to talk to and anything else, then I think you can probably say that this idea was mine. If you're in a scientific sphere where you're doing this and you've read hundreds of papers, you've read thousands of abstracts, and there are all these little pieces there, somewhere the chances are that somebody has mentioned a piece that you've built on rather than this being a great big flash.
I would just add from a writing standpoint, we may all do different things with the actual tome that is our dissertation, but your bibliography and your notes are your best friends because they document where you were at the time you had that idea, and you will forget. how you got there eventually. So I guess I'm not sure if this is exactly what you're asking, but if you're defining a term using several people's definitions that are sort of unsatisfactory in various ways, I would advise you as a writer to write out what's unsatisfactory about each one and cite them, and then come up with your terms so your logic is sort of documented, both for your colleagues to tip your hat to the people who have done things before you, and for yourself 4 years down the line when you come back and decide that definition is really important to your next project, and you want to remember kind of what your thought process was that got you there. So I guess the mixture is, from my sense as a writer, it is your own idea, but you also do yourself no favors by pretending it didn't come from all of these other things. So lots of citations in dissertations, many of which end up getting cut out of final monographs probably. But if you've got that document to go back to, I use my bibliography for my dissertation all the time because it's the most comprehensive thing I have, which is frightening to me in some ways. But at any rate, the more you can put in there, the more resource you have for later.
So I have another question about how to conclude what is the difference between the student and the scientist? When I will become a scientist? Is it after my dissertation or after many publications? Because
The scientist is a way of being.
This work when I try to write my point of view or my own definition based on others. I just wanted to came up with one, not 7 and 8, but I came up with one that include all of this. And someone said to me, "You are a student. So when I will be a scientist?" Is it after my dissertation? Is it after many publications? When?
I have several 16-year-old scientists who work in my group right now. I think it was said quietly here, a scientist is a way of thinking and a way of acting. You may not be as complete a scientist right now as you will be in 2 or 3 years or in 20 years or 30 years. I hope to be a more complete scientist 10 years from now than I am now, but when you are following the scientific method, I would say you are a scientist.
I can answer the question a little bit different in terms of when you're a scholar and academician, and it doesn't happen at some magical point. I think being a grad student is part of it, finishing your dissertation is part of it, defending the dissertation is part of it, and getting accepted in your field is part of it. So it's a process of growing into the job, and different people will consider you a scientist at different stages. But it's a matter of going through the steps and establishing credibility.
Other questions? Yes, top there.
Hi, my name is Jane from the Department of Physiology and Biophysics. I had a question regarding just the distinction between, like I know Dr. Hall and a couple of the panelists talked about, the publication versus the dissertation. So when you're compiling your dissertation, like, let's say you already have 2 publications, like, how do you, I guess, make that difference? Like, are you just, like, rewriting your publications in the form of a story, more so like a story in the dissertation? Or, is that the place where you kind of, I think Dr. Hall mentioned, you put your own thoughts or your ideas a little bit more, but, obviously in the discussion of your publication, you've already done that a little bit. Is it more that you're writing it in form of one continuous big story? So what is the organization, or what is the thought process in that?
So I am delighted that you asked that question, because the graduate program directors in the School of Medicine have been worried about that for several months, and they're writing a draft policy to give you and them advice about exactly that issue. In our universe, we expect publications in scholarly journals, and then we also expect you to write a dissertation. And they're very different things with very different audiences and very different purposes. But you sit here saying, I've got these 2 publications. How do I make that into a dissertation? Or what is that relationship? There are a number of things to keep in mind. Well, one of the most, I'm assuming we're going to imagine you've published 2 papers, you were first author on them, they included your advisor, some other team members, maybe a collaborator in Montana, something like that. I'm making this up. And now you have to write your dissertation. The general introduction and the general discussion are pretty straightforward in your mind. You're unifying multiple publications and the stories that they tell into one coherent intellectual story with a whole. They need to be related to each other. You need to create that set of relationships in the introduction and the discussion. We talk very casually, oh, just staple those papers together and you'll be done. I can't do that. Nor is that the intent, right? So you've published those papers and you likely gave copyright to the journal. Oops. So now you have to write your dissertation, which is electronically published pretty much instantly after it goes through the ETD, blah, 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 you're going to talk about this afternoon. You need to get copyright release for your own self to put it in a dissertation. This is routinely given, but you need to go and get it. The grad program directors are now asking you put that release in your appendices of your dissertation. All right? Your chapter is probably going to be written in a very, very different way with a very, very different audience and much more personalization than what you sent to August Journal X. It's also only going to reflect your work, not your collaborator's work, not the other guy in the lab's work. It's not going to have the same sets of figures. Right? So it is really quite different, and it's a very personal set of intents. We're trying to write a policy, and it's going to be out really soon, to give you some advice about that, because it is something of a challenge. If you have a pre-published paper, or interestingly, if you want to publish the paper after your dissertation is now available to the universe instantly. So I am afraid that our dark room with quiet thoughts is gone. The internet has opened up lots of communications and many expectations about what you should know before you did X, Y, Z, and what the consequences of your dissemination of the thesis are once it walks out the door. There's a long conversation that follows that.
I think that the piece with your dissertation is for you to present your work. So that's what the dissertation should contain. Anything that you didn't physically do should be either somewhere else or referenced, whereas in a paper, all of that is amalgamated. You don't say, oh, this collaborator did this experiment, this collaborator did this experiment. It is a collaboration, and this is the final piece. Your dissertation is, this is what I did.
And do you just reference either the paper that you published for the piece of data that's maybe critical for your story but that you didn't physically do? And if it hasn't yet been published, do you reference the person who did? Like, how do you talk about it if it really is an important, maybe it's a connection between your two pieces of work or something like that?
If something has been published and the idea is out there, like any other publication, you would say, Jones said blah, 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 and this was really important. You can't use Jones's figure without a copyright release. It's not yours. That means you can't.
In your paper.
You need to get your own copyright release to do that, because you no longer have the copyright. When you've sent it off to Journal Important Land and you're famous, it's not, usually it's not yours.
I understand that you need the copyright to put any of those figures into your dissertation, but if you physically were not the person who created that figure, if you didn't do that experiment, and should you just cite it as information and pull it in?
So there are several different relationships you might have with the person who made those data or owns, if you will, owns those data today. I have absolutely seen people get permission from the person who generated the photograph or the figure or something to put that photograph into a dissertation.
Okay.
I've seen that a lot. Somebody might have collected some clinical data that's important to your crystal structure of Schmerfelblop, and you say, could I use that figure? And they say, sure, here's my letter saying you can do that. We're happy to have it. You cite that in the figure legend. This was obtained from Dr. So-and-so, and the permissions in the appendix.
Okay.
Perfectly fine. You cannot, and we're seeing this a little too regularly, take a great diagram from Science magazine and add your most brilliant new molecule into the pathway that's in there and say, ta-da, I have my really good working diagram. I think you all recognize that that's not done. You need to completely rework those things. You need to get permission to adapt the figure, right? This has opened a broad new world, and I think that a lot of the students in biomedical sciences, because of our requirement to publish in professional journals, are hitting it maybe sooner than some of the other folks who are going to get there too, about what's protected in your dissertation and what's protected in your journal articles. We're also having to educate the faculty and the thesis committees about these issues as well. I just dealt with somebody yesterday who asked me to remove something from the electronic thesis and dissertations website, where, by the way, you can search anybody's dissertation and look it up instantly with all the figures and all the everything else's, including the thesis committee signatures, who said, you know, we included some data from our collaborator and I never asked him for permission and I don't know what I'm going to do now. And I thought, well, you should have thought of this beforehand. But he said, I thought the dissertation would be on microfiche somewhere at the University of Michigan and no one would ever see it. And it never occurred to me that somebody would see this tomorrow. So we're all wising up to a very, very public process where the students are the ones who actually post the dissertation, at least at Case Western Reserve, in the dark of night. And in fact, even though you've gotten your thesis committee signature saying go ahead and do it, you're doing this by yourself. So in the sciences, we're asking for you to default embargo your thesis, okay, until we figure out all of that copyright stuff if you haven't really proven it to your committee in advance. Embargo your thesis. That means it's released, it's sent to Ohio Link and ETD. It is not released to the public until you allow it to be done. And that embargo can go up for 2 years. This will protect any proprietary material that you might have put in your dissertation that was funded by a pharmaceutical company that didn't want information about that compound out in the public. It will allow you the time to resolve these copyright issues if they weren't done before. And it will allow you perhaps to take some of those data and go and publish them in Science magazine as a novel scientific contribution without some of these complications.
And I want to add just one thing to build on that. If you're doing anything with human subjects research, make sure you contact the IRB, the Institutional Review Board, and have permission to publish human subjects research, because if you fall under their rules and you don't have their permission, you cannot use the data. And we have had, I'm on the IRB board, we have had dissertations and research projects which have been blown out of the water because they went, ex post facto went back and got permissions, and that's against federal regulations, and all of that research has to be thrown out.
One more question, and then we'll have to end this point. One more? Yes.
So when you are hiring a postdoc, I can understand how you would look at their publications or talk to people that are giving recommendations, or even have them give a talk or something like that. But I don't really understand, like, how does the dissertation play into that? Is it just sort of like, okay, they have a PhD, we're going to assume their committee did a good job of making sure that they did the research they're supposed to do and they're capable, or how does like everything we're doing right now actually play into the ability to get a job, at the next step?
And by the way, even for the postdoc, the exact same question would be applicable for you're going off to work for DuPont. In fact, I spent 10 years as a campus recruiter down at Georgia Tech, hiring engineers. As I hire postdocs now, as I coach my students to go out and become postdocs, and as I hired people professionally, I looked at that dissertation research as an indication that you can learn to do something well. It's showing your early track record of success, and for me, that's been pretty much it. It says you can do good work, and usually we have people give a seminar, at least a group meetings type seminar, when they are interviewing for a postdoc, to show that they can also communicate what they did and they can field questions, and make sure the little gray matter is working well. I would say beyond that, that's about as far as it goes for us.
One other thing I think is comes to this communications piece. So, without wishing to suggest that anybody here would do that, many theses are heavily edited by the advisors. So the language in there is built on what the student does, but it's refined. And so to some extent, if I'm talking to somebody who's a postdoc, I might actually read their thesis to look to see how well the written language in there matches how well they can explain themselves. Because one of the things I want a postdoc to be able to do is to be able to write the manuscripts. I do not wish to have to write their manuscripts for them, because that's a waste of everybody's time and effort. And so it's the dissertation. So if you have a set of publications, that's been through the same process. So nobody knows exactly how well you write and speak. And so part of the dissertation is there a disconnect between what you've produced in this dissertation and how well you can explain yourself when you're around here? And if there's a big disconnect there, then there's a real concern.
Can I have one last thing? I think you're asking a question about what is the difference between a scholar and a researcher. And in science, you're a researcher, you're contributing to publications, you're part of a team that's addressing some important question, you help write those papers. If you're the first author, we think you've written that paper, but there is a lot of input from the rest of this team. I mentioned earlier that the dissertation has been, in my history, the only thing that has gotten my graduate students to read anything historical in their field. I hope that that's not true in other fields or in other laboratories. But the dissertation is a mechanism that will allow you to learn very important tasks as a scholar. It really requires you to go back and look at the first thinking in those areas. It really pushes you to say, how are my ideas different from those ideas? It's not like a test in a class or something like that. You say, I've made this great discovery. You have to defend that it's accurate. You have to put it into context. Those are scholarly activities that bring you into earning that Ph.D. We talk about them like you can get a Ph.D. in a box of Cheerios. Less than 1% of the American population has a Ph.D. in every subject combined. These are rare and they're important. So that dissertation is transferring you from the mechanics and the thought of being a professional researcher, in our case, to being a scholar.
I really like that distinction. I just want to add very briefly, the dissertation is two things. It's a document that has to be written clearly and you have to be able to explain, and it's process and sort of a conversation with your faculty members. Remember, your mentoring team is writing letters of recommendation for you. If we can't explain what you did, you've got a problem too. So it's that ongoing conversation between you and all the people that you're working with, both so that you can articulate your new ideas and your contributions, and so that that team that's supporting you and recommending you can likewise speak knowledgeably about your work.
I also sense from your question you're asking, what is the role of my dissertation in my future career? And I can't speak to postdoc hiring and evaluation, because in our school we don't do that. We do assistant professor hiring and evaluation. I sit on our promotions and tenure committee at the school level, and I can tell you the number one question that is asked at third-year review time for assistant professors is, did they publish from their dissertation? If they have not published from their dissertation, that is a red flag. People can overcome that red flag, but that's a bigger challenge. So that's how important the dissertation is. From the point of view of your career, you must publish from it, preferably more than one publication, maybe a conceptual publication, maybe an empirical publication, maybe a policy or practice, whatever in your field is relevant. But the dissertation really sets the stage for an academic career.
Great. I would like to thank our faculty panel for being here this morning, and give them a round of applause, please.